The fluorescent lights of Belmont and Sterling buzzed overhead like trapped wasps, and Eleanor Thornhill could feel exhaustion settling into her bones with the weight of something permanent. Her fingers moved automatically now, creasing corners, smoothing tape, the muscle memory of 6 hours wrapping gifts for people who spent more on a single scarf than she made in a month. Christmas Eve at the upscale department store meant a parade of last-minute shoppers clutching luxury items with careless urgency, and Eleanor was drowning in ribbon and tissue paper while her mind churned through darker calculations. The eviction notice crinkled in her coat pocket every time she moved, a rustling reminder that she had 10 days to produce $200 she absolutely did not have. Sophia was waiting at home with Mrs. Chen from 4B, probably asleep by now, her 5-year-old faith in Christmas morning still innocent and whole. Eleanor had scraped together enough for 3 small gifts and a discount ham, but the gap between what her daughter deserved and what she could provide felt like a chasm opening wider every year. 2 identical black gift bags sat on her wrapping station, both luxury embossed leather with silver handles, both containing items for pickup. She reached for the cashmere scarf, wrapping it with practiced efficiency, tucking it into the first bag. Her manager had told her she could take home the scarf from the return pile, the one with the tiny snag near the hem that made it unsellable at full price. It sat in the second bag, a small mercy in a season that felt merciless. The final customer of the night appeared at 8:47 p.m., a man in an expensive suit with eyes like surveillance cameras, crisp and assessing. He handed her a wrapped parcel with instructions to place it carefully in the remaining luxury bag, no additional wrapping needed, ready for pickup by a Mr. Darcy at 9. Eleanor nodded, exhaustion making her movements mechanical as she processed the transaction and set the completed bag aside. When her shift ended at 9:15, she gathered her things with trembling hands, her feet aching and her head pounding with the dull throb of too much worry and not enough sleep. She grabbed her coat, her purse, and the gift bag containing what she believed was the damaged scarf, one small bright spot in an otherwise devastating month. The store emptied behind her into the cold December night, and she walked 4 blocks to the bus stop with the bag swinging from her hand, unaware that she had grabbed the wrong one, that the leather-bound ledger inside contained information worth killing for, that her exhausted mistake had just set in motion events that would shatter and rebuild her entire world. At home, Sophia stirred sleepily when Eleanor kissed her forehead, and Mrs. Chen left with a tired smile and Eleanor's last $20. Eleanor placed the luxury bag under their small artificial tree, the one with half the lights burnt out and branches that listed sadly to the left, and felt something almost like hope that tomorrow morning her daughter might feel like other children, at least for a moment. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Christmas morning arrived cold and bitter, the kind of December 25th that Alexander Darcy preferred because it matched the frozen landscape inside his chest. He sat in his private study at 6 a.m., the house silent around him, and opened the black luxury bag his courier had retrieved from Belmont and Sterling the night before. His fingers expected the familiar weight of the leather-bound ledger, the one containing 3 years of financial records that could dismantle rival operations and secure 2 critical alliances. Instead, they closed around something light and fragile. He pulled out a crude ornament made from popsicle sticks and glitter, a childish angel with a lopsided halo, and the name Sophia written in uneven letters across the bottom. His breath stopped. Beneath it lay an employee identification badge with a photo of a woman, tired eyes and dark hair pulled back, the name Eleanor Thornhill printed beside a barcode. Alexander stared at these objects like they were artifacts from another planet, his mind moving through calculations with the cold efficiency that had kept him alive and powerful for 15 years. Someone had switched the bags. Someone now possessed his ledger. The logical response was immediate containment. Find the woman, retrieve the property, eliminate the security breach. But the ornament sat on his desk, radiating an innocence so complete it felt obscene in this room where he had ordered executions and planned destruction. Christmas. The word tasted like ash and blood, like the morning he had returned home to find his wife Maria and infant son Gabriel murdered in their bed, a message from the Calabrese family written in the only language the criminal underworld respected. He had burned Christmas out of his life that day, forbade decorations in his home, worked through every December 25th since with deliberate brutality to prove the holiday held no power over him. Now a child's handmade angel sat on his desk like an accusation. Alexander pressed the intercom and summoned James Hastings and Thomas Wilton, his most trusted enforcers. Meanwhile, across the city in her cramped apartment, Eleanor knelt beside the small artificial tree, with Sophia bouncing excitedly beside her, and reached for the expensive black bag. Her daughter's enthusiasm was infectious despite Eleanor's exhaustion, and she managed a smile as she opened the bag expecting cashmere. Her hands touched leather instead. The ledger was heavy, bound in expensive material, and when she opened it, her blood turned to ice. Columns of numbers, names she recognized from news reports about organized crime, dates and locations, and coded transactions that her tired brain still understood meant something dangerous and illegal. This was not a scarf. This was evidence. This was someone's insurance policy or blackmail material or operational record. This was the kind of thing people died for possessing. Sophia reached for it with curious fingers, and Eleanor jerked it away with a sharpness that made her daughter's face crumple. She forced her voice to gentle, told Sophia to play with her other gifts, and moved to the kitchen with trembling hands. She needed to think. She needed to figure out how this happened, and what to do, and whether she should go to the police or return to the store, or just burn the damn thing and pretend she never saw it. But before any plan could form, heavy knocking struck her apartment door with a patience more terrifying than violence. Eleanor froze. The knocking continued, steady and inevitable. Through the peephole she saw two men in expensive wool coats, their faces calm and professional. One of them looked directly at the peephole, as if he knew she was watching, and said in a voice smooth as silk and cold as a blade that Mr. Darcy would like his property returned. Eleanor's mind fractured into pure survival instinct, the kind that had kept her afloat through evictions and empty cupboards and the grinding terror of raising a child alone. She knelt in front of Sophia, forcing her voice into something light and playful, telling her daughter they were going to play hide and seek, that she should go to the bedroom closet and stay very quiet until Mama came to find her. Sophia's eyes lit up with the simple joy of a game, and Eleanor watched her daughter disappear down the narrow hallway before turning back to the door where the knocking continued with that same terrible patience. She approached with the ledger clutched against her chest, her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her throat, and engaged the chain lock before opening the door just wide enough to see the two men clearly. They were not what she expected. No movie villain sneers or obvious weapons. Just two men in their 40s wearing coats that probably cost more than her car, their faces professionally neutral. The one who had spoken through the door, tall with graying temples and eyes like a banker assessing risk, offered her a smile that never reached those eyes. "James Hastings," he said by way of introduction, "and this is Thomas Wilton, and we apologize for disturbing your Christmas morning, but there has been a misunderstanding regarding a package from Belmont and Sterling." Eleanor's voice came out steadier than she felt as she claimed ignorance, explained that she worked gift wrap at the store and sometimes brought home damaged returns, that she must have grabbed the wrong bag in her exhaustion, that she had no idea what was inside until this morning. James listened with the focus of someone cataloging every word for later analysis, and when she finished he nodded as though she had confirmed exactly what he suspected. "The problem, Ms. Thornhill," he said with that same terrible courtesy, "is that the item you possess is quite valuable to Mr. Darcy, and he would like to retrieve it personally and have a conversation with you to ensure this unfortunate accident does not become a larger issue. It was not a request, and Eleanor understood with cold clarity that refusing would solve nothing, that these men would simply take what they wanted, and her cooperation was a fiction they were politely maintaining. She told them she could not leave her daughter, her voice cracking on the words, and watched James exchange a glance with Thomas before pulling out a phone and stepping back to make a brief call. The answer came back in less than 30 seconds, and James returned to the door with that same empty smile to tell her that Mr. Darcy understood her concern and suggested she bring the child, that this was a family matter after all and could be resolved quickly if everyone cooperated. Eleanor felt her stomach drop because bringing Sophia into whatever waited at the end of this conversation felt like the worst decision she could make. But leaving her daughter here alone or with a neighbor while she disappeared with armed men felt worse. She asked for 5 minutes to get Sophia ready, and James agreed with a nod, adding that a car waited downstairs and Mr. Darcy did not appreciate being kept waiting long. Eleanor closed the door with shaking hands and went to collect her daughter from the closet, wrapping the child in her winter coat and weaving a story about a quick visit to return something, her mind screaming warnings she could not afford to hear. The black car idling at the curb was exactly what she expected, sleek and expensive with windows tinted dark, and Thomas opened the rear door with the same professional courtesy that made everything more frightening. The drive took 20 minutes through the city, and Eleanor held Sophia tight in the back seat while her daughter whispered questions she could not answer, the ledger heavy in her bag like a bomb counting down. She watched familiar streets give way to unfamiliar ones, the buildings growing larger and farther apart, until finally they passed through iron gates into an estate that looked like something from a different world entirely. And Eleanor understood with sinking dread that once Alexander Darcy had his property back, she and Sophia would know too much to simply walk away. The Darcy estate rose before them like something from another world, all stone and iron and old money wrapped in winter silence. And Eleanor felt her breath catch as Thomas guided them through gates that closed behind the car, with a finality that made her stomach twist. Sophia pressed her face to the window with wide eyes, whispering that it looked like a castle, and Eleanor pulled her daughter closer, while her mind catalogued exits and vulnerabilities with the desperate focus of prey in a predator's den. They were led through double doors into a foyer that stretched up 2 stories, marble floors reflecting light from chandeliers that probably cost more than Eleanor would earn in a lifetime, and the walls were hung with art that looked museum quality, abstract pieces in dark colors that suited the cold elegance of the space. What struck Eleanor most was the complete absence of Christmas, no tree or garland, or even the smallest concession to the holiday that everywhere else in the city celebrated with aggressive cheer. And the emptiness felt deliberate, a statement carved in expensive silence. James led them down a hallway lined with closed doors, their footsteps echoing, and Eleanor held the ledger against her chest like a shield, while Sophia's small hand gripped hers, with increasing tightness as the playful excitement faded into uncertainty. They stopped at a heavy wooden door, and James knocked once before opening it to reveal a study that belonged in a different century, all dark wood and leather and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and behind a massive desk sat Alexander Darcy. Eleanor had not let herself imagine what the man would look like, but the reality still hit her like a physical blow, because he was younger than she expected, maybe late 30s, and devastatingly handsome in a way that made him more dangerous rather than less, like beauty designed as camouflage for something lethal underneath. Dark hair swept back from a face that could have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and brutal symmetry, and when his eyes lifted to meet hers, they were the pale blue of winter ice, cold and assessing and entirely without mercy. He looked at her for a long moment that felt like being dissected, and then his gaze shifted to Sophia, and something flickered in that frozen expression, too quick for Eleanor to identify, before it disappeared behind perfect control. He dismissed James and Thomas with a slight gesture, and the door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like a cell locking, and Eleanor stood in the center of the room with her daughter pressed against her side and the ledger burning in her hands, while Alexander Darcy studied them both with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world and knew it. He asked in a voice like smoke and steel if she had looked inside the ledger, and Eleanor forced herself to meet those terrible eyes and admit that yes, she had seen enough to understand what it was, and she watched his expression remain perfectly neutral as he processed her honesty. The silence stretched between them, heavy with calculation and threat. And then Sophia's voice cut through it with the fearless clarity of a child who did not yet understand danger, asking why he did not have a Christmas tree, because everyone should have a Christmas tree, especially on Christmas. The question hung in the air like a grenade, and Eleanor saw Alexander's face transform for just a heartbeat into something raw and wounded before the mask slammed back into place. And when he spoke again, his voice had edges sharp enough to draw blood, as he told Eleanor she had seen information that could destroy him, and asked with chilling calm what exactly she proposed he do about that. Eleanor's survival instinct kicked in with the cold clarity that had carried her through years of impossible choices, and she met Alexander Darcy's ice-blue eyes without flinching as she forced her voice steady and proposed a deal, telling him she would forget everything she saw in the ledger, sign whatever legal documents he required, disappear to another city if necessary, but her daughter had to stay safe because Sophia was innocent in all of this and deserved a life untouched by whatever world Eleanor had stumbled into. Alexander listened without any visible reaction, his expression carved from stone, and the silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see if the ground would hold or crumble beneath her feet. Then he leaned back in his chair with a deliberation that made her pulse stutter, and countered with his own terms, his voice smooth as smoke, as he observed that she clearly needed money, given the eviction notice that had fallen from her bag when his men collected her, and he needed someone beyond suspicion to make certain deliveries during the holiday season. Someone ordinary and invisible who could provide cover for other operations without drawing attention. Eleanor's stomach dropped as she understood what he was proposing, that she become part of his criminal enterprise. But before she could refuse, he continued with clinical precision, laying out that she would work for him for 2 weeks through the Christmas season, making innocuous deliveries of sealed packages. And in exchange, her debts would disappear, her rent paid, and her eviction notice handled, her silence bought and guaranteed, and she and her daughter would remain completely untouched by any consequences of this unfortunate mistake. Eleanor wanted to refuse outright, wanted to grab Sophia and run, even though she knew that was impossible, but she also knew with sick certainty that she had no leverage here. That Alexander Darcy held every card and was offering her a way out that kept her daughter safe, even if it bound Eleanor to him in ways that terrified her. She heard herself ask what happened after the 2 weeks ended, her voice barely above a whisper, and Alexander's expression remained perfectly neutral as he told her that if she proved trustworthy, they would part ways with no further connection. But if she did not, well, he let the sentence hang unfinished in the air like a blade. The tension between them stretched taut as wire until it shattered completely when Sophia, who had been standing pressed against Eleanor's side in uncharacteristic silence, suddenly walked toward Alexander's massive desk with the fearless curiosity of a child who had not yet learned that some people were dangerous. Eleanor's heart stopped as she watched her daughter pull the handmade popsicle stick angel from her coat pocket, the one she had been so proud of making at preschool, and place it carefully on the dark polished wood in front of Alexander before announcing with absolute conviction that everyone needed Christmas, and he should have this because his house was too sad without decorations. Alexander stared at the crude ornament like Sophia had placed a live explosive in front of him, and for just a heartbeat, Eleanor saw past his armor to something shattered and bleeding underneath, a grief so raw it made her chest ache, before he locked it away behind that terrible control. When his eyes lifted to meet Eleanor's again, something had shifted infinitesimally, and he agreed to her terms with one addition, his voice dropping into something almost gentle as he stated that she would come to the estate each day to report on her activities, and she would bring her daughter, because he did not trust that Eleanor would not run if the child was not insurance, and Eleanor understood she was trapped, but also somehow still breathing, still standing, her daughter still safe beside her as she nodded acceptance of a deal with the devil wrapped in beautiful lies. The first 3 days passed in a surreal blur that left Eleanor feeling untethered from reality, moving through a world that operated by rules she was only beginning to understand. And each morning she left Sophia at the estate with Mrs. Whitmore, an elderly housekeeper whose lined face showed both terror and devotion when she looked at Alexander, before driving to locations throughout the city to deliver sealed packages that she knew better than to question. The deliveries themselves were mundane, restaurants and office buildings and expensive homes where people accepted the packages with brief nods and no conversation, and Eleanor forced herself not to speculate about contents or purposes because ignorance felt like the only protection she had left. Each evening she returned to the estate and reported to Alexander in his study, standing before that massive desk while he questioned her with unnerving precision about every detail she had observed, asking about traffic patterns and whether anyone followed her, and if the recipients seemed nervous or satisfied, and she realized with creeping certainty that he was testing her, watching for signs of betrayal or dangerous curiosity or weakness he could exploit. But something else was happening too, something she noticed in fragments that accumulated into an impossible picture, because Sophia had decided with the fearless certainty of a 5-year-old that the cold mansion needed Christmas and had begun decorating with whatever materials she could find. Eleanor would return from deliveries to discover paper chains made from discarded documents draped along the hallway, crayon drawings of snowmen taped to expensive wallpaper, and the sound of Christmas carols sung in a high, clear voice, echoing through rooms that had been silent for 15 years. Mrs. Whitmore enabled this transformation with quiet delight, providing Sophia with scissors and tape and colored paper, and Eleanor suspected the elderly woman was grateful for the light and noise that filled the emptiness, for the excuse to remember holidays that Alexander had forbidden. Alexander himself never commented on the decorations, never acknowledged the red and green paper chains or the crooked snowflakes, but Eleanor caught him watching Sophia with an expression that made her chest ache, because it was not anger or irritation, but raw pain. Grief so deep it seemed to radiate from him like cold, and she began to understand that he did not hate Christmas, but was haunted by it, that the holiday represented something so devastating he had spent 15 years trying to erase it from his life. On the third evening, standing in his study while winter darkness pressed against the windows, Eleanor found courage she did not know she possessed, and asked him directly what had happened to make him this way, what had turned Christmas into something he could not bear. His answer was immediate and cold, his voice like steel as he told her that was not part of her employment, that her job was to make deliveries and report back, and not to ask questions about his personal history. Eleanor turned to leave, accepting the dismissal, but as her hand touched the door handle, his voice stopped her, quieter now and stripped of its armor, and he spoke into the silence between them. His wife and infant son had been killed in a rival family attack on Christmas Day 15 years ago, murdered in their home while he was meeting with associates, and he had returned to find his family destroyed and the holiday forever stained with their blood. He had not celebrated since, had not allowed decorations or music or any acknowledgement of Christmas inside his home, had built walls of ice around the date and everything associated with it, and now a 5-year-old child was dismantling those walls with paper chains and crayon drawings and songs sung without fear in halls that had forgotten joy. Eleanor stood frozen with her back to him, hearing the fracture in his voice, and when she finally turned around, she saw Alexander Darcy, not as the dangerous crime lord who held her life in his hands, but as a man who had lost everything that mattered, and had never allowed himself to heal. And the recognition shifted something fundamental in how she saw him and what she understood about the prison he had built from grief and guilt and rage that had nowhere left to go except inward. Eleanor began to see the man beneath the monster during the days that followed, watching Alexander move through his world with a precision that spoke of absolute control earned through violence and calculation. But his reputation, though brutal and thoroughly earned, rested on a code that proved ironclad in ways that surprised her, because she learned from fragments of conversation between his men and observations of how he conducted business that no civilians were ever harmed in his operations, that children were untouchable regardless of circumstance, that debts were paid with meticulous fairness and loyalty, rewarded with a generosity that bordered on feudal. His empire ran on fear, she understood that clearly, but it also ran on something closer to honor. A strange moral structure that existed in the criminal underworld like a shadow legal system, and she watched how his men respected him, not just from terror, but from something deeper that looked almost like devotion. The kind of loyalty that could not be bought or beaten into existence, but had to be earned through consistency and protection. She learned through Mrs. Whitmore's careful stories and observations she pieced together herself that Alexander had grown up in crushing poverty, that his mother worked 3 jobs until her body gave out when he was 14, that his father had been murdered over gambling debts when Alexander was barely 10, and that he had built his power from absolutely nothing through intelligence and ruthlessness, and a willingness to do what others flinched from, climbing from street enforcement to control of half the city through 2 decades of calculated moves. The family he had lost, the wife and infant son murdered 15 years ago, had been the only softness he had ever allowed himself after that brutal childhood, the only vulnerability and armor forged from survival. And their deaths had sealed him inside himself so completely that Eleanor suspected he had not truly let anyone close since. Now she was in his home daily, an unwilling guest, an unwitting prisoner, watching Sophia chip away at his defenses without any awareness that she was doing it. Because the child asked him questions with genuine curiosity about why he worked so late, and whether he liked her drawings, and if he had ever had a dog, showing him her latest crayon masterpieces with pride and treating him like a person rather than a threat. And Eleanor saw him struggle with this unwanted invasion of innocence into his carefully controlled darkness, saw the way his expression would flicker between pain and something almost tender when Sophia laughed or sang or demanded his attention with the fearless entitlement of a child who had never learned to be afraid. One evening, as Eleanor collected Sophia to leave, Alexander's Lieutenant James entered the study with tension radiating from his controlled posture and reported that the Lennox family, a rival organization, had noticed Eleanor's movements throughout the city and were asking questions about her connection to Alexander, and Eleanor watched Alexander's expression transform into something lethal and cold as winter steel. He made a decision with swift finality, his voice dropping into command as he stated that Eleanor and Sophia would stay at the estate until the situation was neutralized, that it was for their protection because the Lennox family would not hesitate to use them as leverage, and Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to refuse this deeper entanglement. But she saw the calculation in his ice-blue eyes and understood with sinking certainty that she and Sophia had become leverage against him whether she wanted that or not, that their safety was now tied to his power, and the safest place for them was within his fortress, where his control was absolute. That night, Eleanor lay awake in a guest room more luxurious than anywhere she had ever slept, all silk sheets and soft lighting, and space that felt impossibly vast after years in cramped apartments, listening to Sophia breathe steadily in the bed beside hers, and realized with creeping dread that somewhere in the past days she had started to trust Alexander Darcy, that the fear that had defined their first encounters had transformed into something far more dangerous. Living in the estate changed everything in ways Eleanor could not have anticipated. The carefully maintained boundaries between captor and captive dissolving into something far more complicated and dangerous, because she began to see Alexander in unguarded moments that revealed the man beneath the armor. Early mornings when she would find him alone in the kitchen drinking coffee before dawn, with his hair slightly disheveled and his expression unguarded, exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes and mouth in a way that made him look younger and more human. Or late nights when she would pass his study and glimpse him working at his desk with documents spread before him, and that same bone-deep weariness radiating from his bent shoulders. They began to talk during these encounters, brief exchanges at first that grew longer as days passed. Conversations that started with practical matters about Sophia's needs or Eleanor's safety, but drifted into deeper territory. And one evening she found herself telling him about Sophia's father, a man named David, who had seemed charming and promising until the pregnancy test came back positive, who had left the moment he learned about the baby, with nothing but a text message and a blocking of her phone number, abandoning her to face poverty and single motherhood alone. She described the grinding nature of that poverty, the fear that woke her at 3 in the morning calculating bills she could not pay, the guilt that consumed her when Sophia asked for things other children had and Eleanor had to say no, the exhaustion of working multiple jobs while trying to be present for her daughter. And Alexander listened with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she had not experienced in years. His ice-blue eyes focused entirely on her face, as if her words mattered, as if her pain deserved acknowledgement. In turn, he revealed fragments of his own past in careful, measured doses, telling her about a mother who worked 3 jobs cleaning houses and offices until her body gave out when Alexander was 14. A woman who died of a heart attack on a subway platform coming home from her night shift. And a father murdered over gambling debts when Alexander was barely 10 years old, shot in an alley and left for the police to find, while Alexander waited at home, wondering why dinner was late. He described the choice to survive by becoming what he hated, the decision at 16 to work for the very people who had destroyed his father, the realization that power was the only protection that mattered in a world that devoured the weak, and Eleanor heard in his voice the same exhaustion she carried, the weight of years spent in survival mode with no space for softness or dreams. The attraction built between them like a tide, undeniable and dangerous, despite every reason it should not exist, and Eleanor felt it in the way his hand would steady her elbow when she stumbled on stairs, the way his eyes followed her across rooms with an intensity that made her skin feel too warm, the way her pulse would jump and her breath would catch when he stood too close, his presence filling her awareness until nothing else existed. One evening after Sophia was finally asleep, exhausted from a day of playing in the estate gardens under Mrs. Whitmore's supervision, Eleanor found Alexander in his study, standing at the window that overlooked the grounds, and when she entered, he turned to face her, and the air between them felt electric and charged, heavy with everything they were not saying. Alexander reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat, and his fingers brushed her cheek with a gentleness that contradicted everything he was, everything she knew him capable of, and his voice was rough when he told her she should not be here, that she deserved better than his world, better than a man whose hands were stained with violence and choices that could never be undone. Eleanor surprised herself by saying that maybe she got to decide what she deserved, that maybe she was tired of other people telling her what her life should look like, and the moment stretched between them taut and fragile. But then Alexander stepped back with visible effort, control reasserting itself over whatever he was feeling, and he told her with quiet finality that he could not offer her safety, and himself too, that the choice would destroy her, and he had destroyed enough already. The Lennox family made their move 3 days after Alexander's withdrawal from Eleanor in his study, and the threat arrived not through violence, but through a message delivered by a neutral intermediary, a lawyer who represented neither side but served as communication channel in the criminal underworld's version of diplomacy. And the terms were brutally simple, according to what James reported to Alexander in a tense meeting that Eleanor was not supposed to overhear, but did because she had been walking past the study door at exactly the wrong moment. Surrender. Eleanor Thornhill and guarantee her permanent silence regarding any information she may have seen in the ledger, or face open war between the Darcy and Lennox organizations, with all the bloodshed and destabilization that would bring to both empires, and the delicate territorial balance that kept the city's criminal operations running smoothly. Eleanor stood frozen in the hallway, her hand pressed against the wall for support as she heard Alexander's response, his voice dropping into that lethal coldness she had not heard directed at anyone in days, stating with absolute finality that he would not hand over an innocent woman to be silenced, that Eleanor Thornhill was under his protection, and that protection was not negotiable regardless of the consequences. His lieutenants argued, their voices rising in frustration as they pointed out that one woman was not worth the bloodshed, that dozens of their men could die in a war over someone who was not even part of their world. That sentiment was a luxury they could not afford when practical survival was at stake. But Alexander's decision remained final and immovable as stone, and Eleanor felt the weight of that crash over her like a physical force, because this man who barely knew her, who owed her nothing, was willing to go to war to protect her and Sophia. She waited until the meeting ended and the lieutenants left with visible tension in their shoulders before she moved, finding Alexander alone on the estate balcony that overlooked the gardens now bare and winter gray. And there was something unguarded in his posture as he stood with his hands braced on the railing that made him look almost vulnerable despite everything he was. Eleanor approached quietly and told him she had overheard, that she understood what he was risking, and that she would testify against the Lennox family, or go to the police, or do whatever it took to end this without violence. But Alexander turned to face her, and his expression was weary and almost sad as he explained that the police were useless here, that they had no jurisdiction in the criminal world's internal affairs, and her testimony would only get her killed more certainly because the Lennox family had connections that reached into law enforcement, and that the only justice that mattered here was the kind his world handled itself through power and negotiation, and when necessary, through force. He asked her a question then that felt like it cost him something essential, his voice rough and his ice-blue eyes searching her face, asking if circumstances were different. If he were different. If he were not what he was. Could she imagine a life that included him? And Eleanor felt her heart pound so hard she could hear it in her ears as she realized what he was truly asking beneath the careful words. She admitted with trembling honesty that she was already imagining it, that she had been imagining it for days despite every reason she should not, and that it terrified her because she knew his world left no room for happily ever after, no space for the ordinary dreams of safety and stability that Sophia deserved. But the wanting was there anyway, irrational and undeniable, and growing stronger every day. Alexander closed the distance between them in 2 strides, and this time he did not stop himself, did not pull back or rebuild his walls, and the kiss was fierce and desperate and tasting of everything they could not have, all the impossible futures and dangerous present colliding in the press of his mouth against hers, and the way his hands framed her face like she was something precious and breakable. When they broke apart, both were shaken and breathing hard, and Alexander made her a promise, with his forehead resting against hers, and his voice barely above a whisper, telling her he would end the Lennox threat through negotiation or force, whatever it required, and then she would be free to leave with her daughter, her debts paid, and her safety guaranteed permanently, able to return to her ordinary life without his darkness following her. Eleanor realized with aching clarity that pierced through her chest like a blade that she no longer wanted ordinary, that the cramped apartment and endless work shifts and small safe existence felt like a prison now compared to the intensity of what she felt standing here with Alexander. But she also knew with maternal certainty that his world would consume Sophia's innocence, that raising her daughter surrounded by violence and fear and moral compromise was not love but selfishness, and the impossible choice loomed before her with no right answer and no way forward that did not require sacrifice. Alexander set his plan in motion the following morning with the cold precision that had built his empire, arranging a meeting with Christopher Lennox on neutral territory through the same lawyer who had delivered the original threat, and the location chosen was a private room in an upscale downtown restaurant that neither organization controlled, a place where violence would draw too much attention and therefore safety existed in the exposure. It was a calculated risk, but Alexander had leverage that he had spent the past 48 hours confirming through his network of informants and financial analysts, discovering that Christopher's organization had been skimming from joint partnerships with three other families, siphoning profits in ways that violated the treaties that kept the criminal underworld's delicate balance intact. And proof of this skimming would unite those other families against Christopher in ways that would destroy his empire faster than any war Alexander could wage alone. The night before the meeting, the estate felt suspended in unnatural quiet, like the air before lightning strikes, and Eleanor moved through the halls with anxiety crawling under her skin because she knew tomorrow could end in violence despite all the careful planning, knew that Alexander would be walking into a room with a man who wanted her dead and trusting that words and evidence would be enough to protect them all. Sophia remained innocent to the danger as only a child could be, and that evening she found Alexander in his study, reviewing documents, and convinced him with her particular brand of fearless persistence to help her finish decorating the main hall, something she had been working on for days with Mrs. Whitmore's assistance. And Eleanor followed them and watched with her heart in her throat as this hardened criminal who had built an empire on fear and violence awkwardly hung paper snowflakes under her daughter's exacting direction, his large, scarred hands fumbling with tape while Sophia critiqued the placement with 5-year-old authority. Something inside Eleanor's chest cracked open watching them together, this impossible pairing of innocence and darkness that should not work, but somehow did. And she saw in Alexander's face a softness that he probably did not know he was revealing, a glimpse of the father he had been for such a brief time before tragedy stole that future from him. Later, after Sophia finally fell asleep, exhausted from decorating and excitement, Alexander came to Eleanor's room and knocked softly, and when she opened the door, he stood in the hallway for a long moment, just looking at her like he was memorizing every detail, the curve of her face, and the way her hair fell loose around her shoulders, and the concern in her eyes that was there because of him and for him simultaneously. He did not speak at first when she let him in, just moved to where she stood and framed her face with his hands, and then he told her in a voice rough with emotion that if the meeting went wrong tomorrow, if Christopher Lennox proved more dangerous or unpredictable than anticipated, James had instructions to take her and Sophia somewhere safe, with new identities and enough money to start over anywhere in the world, to disappear so completely that no one from his world could ever find them. Eleanor felt cold fear flood through her, and she refused to accept this possibility, refused to let him talk as if his death was an acceptable outcome, and she asked him to promise he would come back to them, demanded it with her hands fisted in his shirt and her voice breaking on the words. Alexander could not promise that, because he had never lied to her and would not start now when the stakes were this high, so instead he showed her what he could not say with words, pulling her close and kissing her with an intensity that spoke of desperation and longing and the terrible fear of losing something precious before truly having it. The love scene that followed was intense and tender and desperate all at once, two people stealing something precious before fate could rip it away. And Eleanor memorized the feel of his hands on her skin and the weight of his body and the way he whispered her name like a prayer against her throat. And afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, with her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat, and neither of them sleeping because morning was coming too fast. In that suspended, intimate space, Eleanor told him she loved him, the words escaping before she could stop them or dress them in careful qualifications. And Alexander's response was raw and unguarded, his arms tightening around her as he told her that no one had said those words to him since his wife died, that he did not deserve them, especially not from her, not from someone good and innocent who represented everything his choices had destroyed. Eleanor argued through tears that deserving had nothing to do with it, That love was not logical or earned, but simply existed, that she saw him completely, all of him, including the darkness and the violence and the terrible choices, and she chose this anyway, chose him anyway despite every reason she should not. The meeting with Christopher Lennox took place at 2 in the afternoon in a private room of an upscale downtown restaurant called Meridian that neither organization controlled, a deliberate choice of neutral ground where violence would draw too much attention from the wrong people, and therefore an uneasy safety existed in the very exposure of the location. Alexander arrived with James and Thomas flanking him, their presence a reminder that he came prepared even as the terms dictated minimal security, and Christopher Lennox was already seated when they entered, a man in his early 50s with silver hair and a face that looked pleasant, until you noticed the coldness in his eyes, the kind of coldness that came from decades of making brutal decisions without hesitation. The negotiation began with formalities that barely masked the hostility crackling between them, and Alexander laid out his evidence methodically, presenting financial records and testimony from informants that proved Christopher's organization had been skimming profits from joint operations with 3 other families, violations of treaties that kept the delicate balance of criminal power intact in the city. The proof was damning and comprehensive, and Christopher's expression tightened as he realized the leverage Alexander held. But instead of capitulating immediately, he leaned back in his chair and smiled without warmth, pointing out that Alexander's sudden weakness for Eleanor Thornhill had already been noticed by multiple organizations. That sentiment was a fatal flaw in their world, and that a man who would risk war over a woman was a man whose judgment could no longer be trusted. The words landed like blows because they contained truth that Alexander could not deny. And the negotiation became a battle of wills, with both men calculating how much damage the other could inflict, and whether the cost of conflict outweighed the benefits of resolution. Christopher proposed terms slowly and deliberately, stating he would leave Eleanor Thornhill alone and guarantee her permanent safety in exchange for Alexander's ceding territory in the Port District, a lucrative area that controlled shipping access, plus 15% of profits from 3 operations they had previously split equally, concessions that amounted to a significant loss of power and revenue that would weaken Alexander's position relative to other families and invite future challenges to his authority. Alexander's lieutenants, seated behind him, shifted uneasily because they understood the implications, understood that accepting these terms meant their organization would be diminished and vulnerable. But Alexander met Christopher's gaze without flinching and stated his agreement with a finality that left no room for further negotiation. The deal was struck with handshakes that felt like surrenders, and the entire meeting lasted less than 45 minutes, a brief window of time in which Alexander traded pieces of his empire for the safety of a woman and child who had entered his life by accident. When Alexander returned to the estate hours later, Eleanor was waiting in the main hall, and she saw the cost written across his face in new lines of exhaustion and something that looked like defeat, and he told her with careful distance that it was over. She was safe. Christopher Lennox had agreed to leave her alone permanently, and she could leave whenever she chose, return to her life without fear. His walls had rebuilt themselves during the drive home, the vulnerability of the previous night buried again under layers of control, and Eleanor understood immediately what he was doing, recognized the self-sacrifice in his withdrawal, the way he was protecting her by pushing her away before she could choose to stay in a world that had just proven how dangerous loving him could be. She confronted him with her hands clenched at her sides and her voice shaking, demanding to know if the past days had meant anything, or if she had been just a temporary distraction, a moment of weakness he now regretted. And Alexander's control fractured visibly as he closed the distance between them and told her with raw honesty that she had meant everything, which was exactly why she had to go, because his world had nearly gotten her killed, and Sophia deserved better than to grow up in a fortress, surrounded by violence and fear, and the constant threat of being used as leverage against him. Eleanor could not argue with that logic, because it was rooted in truth and maternal love. but she refused to let him make this decision alone, refused to be protected out of her own choice, and she told him she needed time to think, to figure out what was possible and what she could live with. Alexander agreed to give her space with visible effort, but the brittleness in his expression suggested he expected her to choose the sensible path, the one that led away from him and back to safety and ordinary struggles that did not include negotiating with criminals or watching the man she loved sacrifice pieces of his empire to keep her breathing. Christmas Eve arrived exactly 2 weeks after the gift mix-up that had pulled Eleanor Thornhill into Alexander Darcy's dangerous world, and she had spent the intervening days since their negotiation in a state of emotional turmoil that left her exhausted and uncertain, trying to envision a future either with or without him while living in the guest room of his estate, with Sophia still believing this was an extended adventure rather than a crisis with life or death stakes. Sophia had asked repeatedly when they were going home, her small voice carrying a note of confusion that broke Eleanor's heart because she realized her daughter missed their cramped apartment despite its poverty and instability, missed the familiar worn furniture and the neighbor who sometimes babysat, and the routine that felt safe even when it was precarious. And Eleanor understood with painful clarity that the life of luxury Alexander could provide meant nothing to a 5-year-old who just wanted stability and her mother's full attention without the weight of adult fear shadowing every interaction. The decision had crystallized slowly over those days, forming like ice over water until Eleanor finally knew what she had to do, even though the knowing felt like tearing herself in half. And that evening, as the sun set on Christmas Eve, she asked Alexander if they could speak privately in his study, the same room where this had all begun with threats and ledgers and a desperate negotiation for survival. He agreed immediately, his expression carefully neutral in that way she had learned meant he was bracing for pain. And they walked through halls that Sophia had transformed with paper decorations and crayon drawings until they reached the dark wood sanctuary of his office where so many dangerous decisions had been made. Eleanor stood before his desk, but did not sit, needing to remain on her feet for this, and she told him with her voice surprisingly steady that she was leaving, returning to her life, because Sophia needed normal, and she could not ask her daughter to grow up in his dangerous world, no matter how much safety his money and power could theoretically provide. Alexander accepted this with controlled grace that was almost perfectly executed, except for the devastation she could see in his eyes before he shuddered it away, his jaw tight and his hands flexing once before he stilled them, and he told her he understood and would arrange for a car to take them home whenever she was ready, that her debts had been cleared as promised, and Christopher Lennox's guarantee of safety remained in force. But Eleanor was not finished speaking, and she continued before her courage could fail, telling him that she was leaving now but not forever, that she wanted him to prove he could change, that he could step back from the most dangerous aspects of his empire and build something with room for light instead of just shadows and violence and the constant weight of threat. If he could do that, truly do it, and not just perform safety while remaining exactly who he had always been, then in 6 months, she would come back with Sophia, and they would see if a life together was actually possible, or if what they felt was just intensity, born of danger and proximity. If he could not change or would not try, then she would know he had loved her enough to attempt the impossible even if he failed, and that would have to be enough closure for both of them. Alexander stared at her like she had offered him something he could not comprehend, hope and terror warring across his features. And he asked in a voice rough with emotion, what happened if he failed, if he tried to change and discovered he was too broken or too deeply embedded in his world to ever truly step away. Eleanor told him then they would both have their answer, and at least they would have tried. At least neither of them would spend the rest of their lives wondering what might have been possible if they had been brave enough to reach for it. Alexander agreed to her terms with visible effort, his control fracturing around the edges, and the goodbye that followed was wrenching in its tenderness, Sophia hugging Alexander with childish enthusiasm and making him promise to have a real Christmas tree next year, while Eleanor and Alexander shared one last kiss that tasted of desperation and longing and promises folded into the press of lips. The following 5 months were the hardest of Alexander Darcy's life, harder than building his empire from nothing, harder than surviving assassination attempts and gang wars, harder even than the years after he lost his family, because now he had something to fight for beyond mere survival, and the weight of hope was more crushing than despair had ever been. He began the painful process of restructuring his organization within days of Eleanor's departure, calling meetings with his most trusted lieutenants, and laying out a new vision that prioritized legitimate business fronts over the violent enforcement that had built his reputation. Delegating the dangerous work to men like James and Thomas, who understood the necessity, but could operate with autonomy, while Alexander stepped back from direct involvement in anything that could bring law enforcement or rival families to his door. He brokered peace agreements with neighboring organizations, offering concessions that made his advisors nervous, trading power for stability in deals that would have seemed weak a year ago, but now felt like strategic repositioning toward a life that had room for a woman and child who deserved better than constant threat. His men noticed the change immediately, the way Alexander's presence at violent negotiations became rare, the way he spent more time in corporate offices than backroom meetings, and reactions split predictably between those whose loyalty was personal and deep enough to adapt, and those who began questioning whether their boss had gone soft, whether sentiment had made him vulnerable in a world that devoured weakness without mercy. Alexander faced two direct challenges to his authority in the first 3 months: younger, ambitious men within his own organization who tested his resolve by refusing orders and making moves without approval, and he handled both situations with calculated precision that proved he had not lost his edge even as he changed his focus, reminding everyone that stepping back from daily violence did not mean he had forgotten how to wield power when necessary. Every decision was weighed against the image of Eleanor and Sophia, the mental picture of them that sustained him through late nights and moments of doubt, and he found himself doing things he never imagined, like consulting with lawyers about legitimate business expansion and meeting with financial advisors about transitioning assets into legal channels, building a foundation that could support a family rather than just an empire. Meanwhile, Eleanor returned to her ordinary existence in the cramped apartment she had nearly lost before Alexander intervened, and the transition back to normal felt hollow in ways she had not anticipated, like putting on clothes that no longer fit properly, even though nothing external had changed. She worked her jobs, cared for Sophia with the same devotion she always had, and rebuilt their modest routine of preschool drop-offs and grocery shopping and evenings spent reading stories before bed. But every single day she thought of Alexander with an intensity that bordered on physical pain, wondering if he was keeping his promise or if she had asked the impossible, demanded change from a man whose entire identity was built on control and power and calculated violence. She received no direct contact from him per their agreement, no calls or letters or messages, but occasionally she noticed small things that carried his invisible fingerprints, like the way her rent was mysteriously paid on time every month, even when her paycheck fell short, or the anonymous donation that appeared at Sophia's preschool funding scholarships for low-income families, or the job opportunity that materialized at a local nonprofit, paying twice what her previous work had offered with better hours and benefits that seemed too good to be coincidence. She suspected Alexander's hand in these kindnesses, but could not prove it, and did not try, accepting them as evidence that he was thinking of her even across the distance they had agreed to maintain. As the 6-month mark approached, Eleanor's anxiety built like a physical pressure in her chest, manifesting in sleepless nights and distracted days where she caught herself staring into space, wondering what she would find when she returned to the estate. Terrified of discovering that he had not changed enough, or worse, that he had moved on entirely, that the intensity of what they shared had faded for him into memory rather than remaining the driving force it was for her. On the night before their agreed reunion, she lay awake in the darkness of her bedroom, listening to Sophia's peaceful breathing from the next room, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread in equal measure, knowing that tomorrow would determine whether the impossible future she had imagined could become real, or if she would have to find a way to let go of the most extraordinary man she had ever known. Eleanor arrived at the estate on the designated day, with her heart lodged somewhere in her throat, pulse hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips as the car she had borrowed from a coworker approached the iron gates that had haunted her dreams for months. And when those gates swung open smoothly, as if her arrival had been anticipated and prepared for, something inside her chest twisted painfully between hope and terror. She had left Sophia with the neighbor, Mrs. Chen, deciding this first meeting needed to happen without her daughter present, in case the reunion went badly, in case Alexander had not changed enough, or had changed so much he no longer wanted what they had discussed on that terrible, beautiful Christmas Eve 6 months ago. Walking through the familiar halls felt surreal, like stepping into a memory that had been polished and rearranged, and Eleanor's breath caught when she entered the main hall and saw what waited there. The room had been transformed utterly. A towering Christmas tree dominated the space, easily 12 feet tall, decorated with elegant ornaments that caught the light and threw it back in shimmering patterns across the marble floor. White lights wound through dark green branches with professional precision, and at the very top, incongruous and perfect, perched Sophia's popsicle stick angel with its crooked halo and lopsided wings. Eleanor stopped walking, one hand rising to cover her mouth as emotion crashed over her, and then she saw Alexander standing near the windows, backlit by afternoon sun, watching her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare. He looked different, some of the hardness worn away from his features, exhaustion visible in the shadows under his eyes, but also something lighter in his expression, something that had not been there before, as if the weight he carried had shifted enough to let him breathe. He moved toward her with that controlled grace she remembered, and when he spoke his voice was rougher than she recalled, textured with uncertainty. He told her what he had done over the past months, the territories ceded to other families, the operations restructured to minimize his personal involvement in anything that could bring violence to his door. The legitimate businesses expanded and prioritized, and he was clear, brutally honest, that he had not become a saint and never would be, that his world still carried darkness and always would, but he had built something new, something that had room for a life beyond mere survival and constant threat. He asked if it was enough, those 4 words carrying the weight of everything, and Eleanor closed the distance between them, reaching for his hands, feeling the familiar calluses and the strength, and the way his fingers tightened around hers, like he was afraid she might vanish. She told him it was more than enough, it was everything she had hoped for, and more than she had dared to believe possible. Alexander exhaled like he had been holding his breath for 6 months straight, and then he told her about the house, a normal house in a safe neighborhood across the city, separate from the estate and the business, with a yard where Sophia could play and neighbors who knew nothing about his past, a place where he wanted to try being ordinary with her, or as close to ordinary as a man like him could manage. Eleanor felt tears burning hot behind her eyes, blurring her vision, and she asked if he was sure, if he could truly leave behind the control and power that had defined him for 2 decades. Alexander admitted with raw honesty that he was terrified, that control had kept him alive and losing it felt like standing naked in a storm, but losing her and Sophia scared him infinitely more. The kiss that followed was different from the desperate passion they had shared before, not frantic, but full of promise and certainty, the beginning of something real and chosen and deliberate. And when Sophia's delighted voice suddenly echoed through the hall, because Mrs. Chen had brought her after all, the 3 of them stood together beside the Christmas tree. An unlikely family forged from danger and choice, and Alexander lifted Sophia onto his shoulders to adjust the angel, while Eleanor watched with her heart so full it ached. Christmas morning in the new house was everything Eleanor had never let herself dream of, the kind of ordinary, beautiful chaos that other families took for granted, but felt like a miracle to her as she watched Sophia tear through presents with gleeful abandon, wrapping paper flying in colorful explosions across the hardwood floor, while Alexander sat on the couch, watching with an expression of wonder so raw it made Eleanor's chest ache, as if he could not quite believe this was his life now, that he was allowed to have this simple, perfect moment. The house itself was nothing like the cold marble fortress of the estate. Instead, it was warm and lived in, a three-bedroom colonial in a neighborhood where children rode bikes on sidewalks and neighbors waved from porches, where no one knew or cared about Alexander Darcy's reputation, because here he was just Alex, the quiet man who had moved in with his girlfriend and her daughter, and Eleanor moved through the bright normal rooms feeling the weight of the past year settle into something precious rather than heavy. Alexander caught her hand as she passed, pulling her down onto the couch beside him, and his voice was low enough that Sophia could not hear over her excited exclamations about the dollhouse that was definitely too extravagant, but made her so happy Eleanor could not regret it. He told her he never believed in second chances until she accidentally put the wrong gift under his tree, and the rough emotion in his words made Eleanor laugh, the sound bright and free in a way that still surprised her because for so long, laughter had felt like a luxury she could not afford. She told him she was grateful every day for that exhausted mistake, for the moment of carelessness that had thrown her into his dangerous world and somehow led to this impossible safety. Later, after Sophia had exhausted herself and fallen asleep on the living room floor, surrounded by new toys and torn wrapping paper, Eleanor and Alexander sat together in the quiet, his arm around her shoulders and her head resting against his chest, where she could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong. He admitted the transition was harder than he expected, that he still woke in the night reaching for control, his mind spinning through threats and contingencies before he remembered he had chosen to step back, but having her and Sophia made it bearable, gave him something to hold on to when the old instinct screamed that letting go meant weakness. Eleanor asked about the business, the dangers that still existed in the shadows of his carefully constructed new life, and Alexander was honest, because they had promised each other nothing less. His world would always carry shadows, he told her, the kind of darkness that never fully disappeared, no matter how many legitimate fronts he built, or how many territories he ceded to other families. But he had constructed walls between that darkness and this life, delegating to men like James and Thomas who understood the necessity and could operate with autonomy, while Alexander focused on being present here, in this bright, ordinary house with the woman and child who had become his entire world. He would never be entirely ordinary, could never erase the violence and power that had defined him for 2 decades, but he could be safe enough for them, careful enough, and that would have to be enough. Eleanor accepted this because love was not about perfection, but about choosing someone despite and because of their complexity, seeing all their jagged edges and broken places, and deciding they were worth the risk anyway.